in book of Genesis. And today we talk about a new start. Genesis chapter 8 describes the receding of the flood waters and the reappearance of dry land. The flood began on the 17th day of the second month, and in verse 4 says, the ark rested in the 7th month of the 17th day of the month upon Mount Ararat. That's a 5-month period. And the Jewish year at this particular time in history has a 12-month calendar of 30 days in each month. And then a 13th month was added every 3 years to account for the new year, to account for leap years and that kind of thing. But when the tops of the mountains became visible, Noah sent out a raven. It went to and fro, the verses tell us, indicating that it could not find a suitable dry habitat. Then Noah sent out a dove, because doves eat seeds. And the dove returned, indicating that the water still remained at tree level. Then Noah waited for another 7 days and sent out a dove again. And it returned with an olive leaf in its beak. And then verses 10 and 11 tells us that Noah knew then that the water had abated. And then so Noah sent out a dove for a third time, and it did not return. And so Noah removed the covering of the ark, and he saw that the earth was dry, and it was time to get off the boat. And in chapter 8, verses 15 and 16, we pick up, and 15 says, and God spake unto Noah, saying, go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. And so before the flood, God commanded Noah to build a boat, to build this ark. And then God commanded Noah when it was time to enter the ark. And now we see that God has commanded Noah the time to exit the ark. In other words, everything related to the ark was commanded by God. The gathering of the animals, the entering of them into the ark, the entering of Noah into the ark, closing the door, the coming of the flood, exiting the ark. Everything was commanded by God. And this is telling us that the judgment was going to be on this sinful generation, and it was exclusively done by God. And he was giving salvation to a righteous man, and that man was Noah. And Noah's part was just pretty simple. He just had to be obedient to what God was commanding. And then in verse 17, bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee, all of the flesh, both of fowl and of the cattle, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. And so Noah here was given a job. He was to unload the animals. And also we notice in this verse that there's always order. There's always order in God's universe. And the exit of these animals would keep that order. It would be in the same order as their creation. First, the fowl, which God created on the 5th day. Then the cattle and the creatures that creepeth upon the earth exited, and God created them on the 6th day. And so they exited just the same way that they were created, in that same order. And next, God told Noah the same thing he told Adam and Eve. He said, be fruitful and multiply. Now, after the flood, of course, there was only 8 people alive. That was Noah and Noah's family, and they would have to start Earth's population all over again. But what this means is that we're all descendants from Noah. Noah here was given the job of getting all the animals off of the boat. And in verses 18 and 19, we're told that Noah obeyed all of God's commands and exited the ark. Noah and his family had been living in a confined space for 5 months. And so I'm sure that with all those animals on board, and they were probably pretty anxious to exit the ark. And of course, this, needless to say, was just a life-changing event. They probably felt isolated. They had just left all of the rest of their family, and their friends were left on earth and perished. And they probably experienced grief. And as I said, it was a time of mixed emotions, because they also were excited to get off the ark, because they had been on the ark for 5 months. They were excited to begin a new life. And there was much work to be done. But when people are real anxious and jumping around, the best thing to do is give them a job. And that's what God did. God gave them the job of getting the animals off, and that would calm them down because, that works today. When people are real anxious, give them a job to do. And, of course, I found that out from teaching school, keep the kids busy and give them a job, and they're fine. You don't give them a job, and you'll be running them down the halls somewhere. So when people get anxious, give them something to do. In verse 20, and Noah built an ark unto the Lord, and took every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered a burnt offering on the altar. And so when they got all the animals off, Noah then built an altar to God, telling us, that we need to worship God. And that was the very first thing he did when he got situated. And Noah set a precedent. Also, we find later in the Bible, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, they all built altars to God, to worship God. Noah had taken enough clean animals on the ark to be able to offer them as a sacrifice to God after the flood. Later in Leviticus chapter 1, God would give specific instructions and specific commands on how to offer the offerings that he received, because he received 5 different kinds of offerings. This was a burnt offering. This was an offering of thanksgiving to God for deliverance for Noah's family after the flood. Then in verses 21 and 22, we find that the Lord, it says, smelled a sweet savor, meaning there was just a smell of satisfaction coming off of that sacrifice that was made to him. God was making a declaration about the future. God is telling us of his redeeming mercy. It was nothing that Noah done to deserve to be the person getting off the earth, getting off the boat. It was all by God's grace. And these verses also tell us, that the power of sin is great, that the desires of flesh are great, and therefore we're helpless to do it on our own. We're helpless to help ourselves. But these verses tell us that God is merciful to us, and he's merciful to the needs of humanity. And humanity needs that grace, because there are things in this world that we cannot do, and that we need God to provide for it. Later on in history, the basis of grace is given, and God provided Jesus as his sacrifice on the cross for our sins. And now here, verse 22 tells us that the flood had disrupted also the normal seasons, the rhythm of the seasons, which are, there was a season for planting, there was a season for harvesting, and there was seasons associated for various things. And what this verse is telling us is God was bringing it back to normal, that there was much work to be done, and God was bringing these seasons back in to normal so that Noah and his family could get about their business. And then in chapter 9, verse 1, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And so in verse 1, God repeats his command to be fruitful and multiply. And this is telling us that, telling our generation, since we are all descendants of Noah, that there should be no reasons for racism or elitism or prejudice of any kind, because when you get right down to it, we're all descendants of Noah. Amen. And then in verse 2, God gave the animals as food to the humans. And God stated that animals would now fear humans because of that. Up until this time, they hadn't feared humans, but now they would be hunted. And when anybody is hunted, or when you're cornered, you're going to strike out. And so God is telling them that now that the animals are going to fear humans because he's given them to them as food. And God later on gives specific food requirements, that they were to eat only clean animals. And in verse 4, but the flesh with life thereof, which is the blood thereof, ye shall not eat. And so the Jewish people had, later on, as I said, they would get more instructions on this, but what it's talking about is they were not to eat the blood. They were to soak their food with salt, and so to get all of the blood out, because they were only to eat clean animals, and then they were not to eat blood, because in the Old Testament, blood is associated with life, giving it special meaning to the shedding of blood. And so they were to soak and salt their meat before they ate it. Also, God allowed the shedding of animal blood, but in verses 5 and 6, God forbid the killing of humans, shedding of human blood. And of course, there were later on many false gods that the people would sacrifice, give human sacrifice. And God is letting them know right here that, they're forbid from killing humans. And part of that is for human sacrifice. And then he announces the death penalty for murder. But I want you to understand that this is a governmental society issue. It is not for a revenge one-on-one issue. People were not to take their law into their own hands. It is a governmental society issue. So, that a lot of people misunderstand that eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. God said he would take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, not for us to take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Also, it's a governmental issue, not a revenge issue one-on-one. But verse 11, and I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there be any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And so before the flood, God stated that he would make a covenant with Noah. And then in chapter 6, verses 18, God reaffirms that covenant. And this covenant was surely and was only God's covenant. Noah really didn't have to do anything but be obedient. But God's covenant with Noah required no special behavior on Noah's part. The covenant consisted of God's promise that he would never again destroy all flesh with the flood. And God repeated that message here to emphasize the certainty of his promise not to destroy the earth and its inhabitants with a flood. And then in verses 12 and 13, God stated the covenant with Noah. His covenant was not only with Noah, but it was with every living creature. And it also lets us know that it will last as long as humanity lives on the earth. And later, God would make a covenant with other people. God's covenant he made with Abraham required a circumcision on humanity's part. And God's covenant made with the people at Mount Sinai with Moses involved two signs. First was the Ark of the Covenant, where 2 tablets and the 10 Commandments were placed in. And secondly was the tabernacle. And then in verse 13, I do set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a token of a covenant between me and the earth, and it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow shall be seen in the clouds. And so when God made this covenant with Noah, he provided a sign, and that sign was a bow would appear in the clouds, and of course that was a rainbow. Now you might think, well, a rainbow is no great thing or whatever, but you have to understand that Noah and his family had just seen it rain for 40 days and 40 nights, and so I'm sure every time they saw a rain cloud come up, they probably got a little anxious. And so God was letting them know he's going to give them a sign that they would remember what he said, that he was not going to destroy the world again with a flood. And so that would give them some reassurance of the clouds and the rain that they were getting at that time. And so sometimes we all need a little bit of reassurance, and God was giving them some reassurance. And then in verse 15, God said that when he himself saw the bow, that he would remember the covenant with humanity. Now, of course, God didn't need it for his sake. God wasn't saying that for his sake. What God was doing is he was saying that for our sake. And God always keeps his promises. And this new start would be demonstrated by God's grace. And, of course, this was the new beginning for humanity and Noah's family, and they were the first family to receive God's grace. And they did that through Noah's faith in God. And then, of course, a little bit, before that, of course, God had shown grace to Enoch. We know that because Enoch never died. He was taken by God, and God certainly gave him grace. But this is talking about, this is the grace for Noah's family. And then in verse 28, and Noah lived after the flood 350 years. And so Noah lived another 350 years after the flood. Noah was 950 years old when he died. The Tower of Babel was 340 years after the flood. This means that Noah was still alive at the time of the Tower of Babel. And the population at the time of the Tower of Babel was 2.8 million. And this means that at the time of Noah's death, he had 2.8 million descendants. So God had certainly been gracious to Noah. And Noah, at his time of his death, had almost 3 million descendants. But chapter 10 is the beget chapter. It gives us the genealogy of a lot of people. The whole chapter is a chapter of begets, but the main point is that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Mary, Joseph, Jesus, they were all from the lineage of Noah's son Shem. And Jesus' legal father, of course, under Jewish law, was Joseph, who was of the lineage of David through David's son Solomon. And, of course, Jesus was conceived by a Virgin Mary. And Mary, Jesus' biological mother, traces her lineage through David's son Nathan. And so all of these have the same lineage through Noah's son Shem. And to review, Noah's flood occurred 1,657 years after God created Adam and Eve. And the population at that time was estimated to be between 500 and 700 million people that were going to die in that flood. Only 8 people survived the flood by the will of God: Noah, Noah's wife, his 3 sons and their wives. His 3 sons' names were Ham, Japheth, and Shem. And they landed on Mount Ararat, and that's in Turkey. And the mountain areas, they're good for growing certain things like coffee and grapes and that kind of thing. But mountains really are not ideal for farming. And so Noah and his family moved eastward from the Turkey area to the Mesopotamia area. And the Mesopotamia area is a very fertile area of land known as the cradle of civilization. And it's a tract of land between 2 great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And this is an area of 700 miles, 700 long miles long and 200 miles wide. And the area Noah and his family migrated to is the northwestern portion of land where the Tigris and the Euphrates River bend together. And the land is very fertile for farming because there's flooding of those rivers, and it brings topsoil in. And it's here that the Tower of Babel took place, and that's what we're going to talk about next in chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. Verse 1 in chapter 11, and the whole earth was one language and one speech. And so the Tower of Babel took place 339 years after the flood. Noah lived another 350 years after the flood, so this was 11 years before Noah's death. And the people, they had resumed their disobedient lifestyle. They had, God destroyed the earth because of disobedience and sinful nature. Well, God had been down this road before, and this people in that area were disobedient to God. And God's desire for population to spread all over the entire earth. In Genesis 1:28 tells us that God told Adam and Eve to replenish the earth. And then in Genesis 9:1 he tells Noah to bring forth abundantly in the earth. But chapter 11 tells us that humanity was not spreading. And in fact, they were close enough together that even after 339 years, all the people there spoke the same language. In verse 2, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And so the ark landed on Mount Ararat, and as we've already said, that mountains are good for growing coffee and stuff like that, but you can't live off coffee and grapes. And so they moved to an area where they could farm, and that was the eastern part of Turkey. And as we notice here, verse 2 says they journeyed east. East in the Bible is a reference meaning they traveled away from God. When Adam and Eve were placed outside the garden, a cherubim was placed on the east side to prevent their return. When Cain was banished, he went east, away from God. When Lot moved to Sodom, he went east. When Jacob fled his homeland, he went east. And so in the Bible, east is a reference to moving away from God. And then in verse 3, and they said to one another, go to and let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And so verses 2 and 3 tell us that the people were moving east, they were moving away from God, and they settled in the area near Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. And the area there is rich soil, but it tells us here that it also had plentiful building supplies and building material because the river supplied the water, and they could make bricks. And the buildings in that day were made from baked and sun-dried bricks because there was not a lot of wood in that area, and it was scarce, but the bricks could be made abundantly. And so it tells us here that they also had slime, and slime was used for mortar. Slime in that day was a mineral tar, and it was decomposition of animals and vegetation, but when it hardened into like an asphalt. And then in verse 4, and they said, go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach into the heavens, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And so verse 4 tells us that it was the people's desire to build a city and a tower. And this is the second time the Bible mentions building a city. The first was when Cain built a city. And you remember God told Cain that he would be a fugitive and a vagabond in Genesis 4:12. But Cain had other ideas, and Cain was moving east. He was moving away from God. And he built a city and called the city Enoch after his son. It's not the Enoch that God took. But of course that city of Enoch became a city of evil. And here the people wanted to build a tower which would reach to the heavens. And the goal of the builders was to make a name for themselves. And so the motive for the project was pride. And of course, pride can lead to sin, and the sin of arrogance, because people begin to feel self-sufficient. They begin to think that they don't need God. And that's what happens even to a lot of people today, that when things are going good, when we're successful, we begin to think that we did it. And we begin to think that we're successful, and we begin to think we can make plans on our own, and that we begin to leave God out. Pride and arrogance breeds belief that we can solve our own problems, and we don't need God to help us. And that's the problem there. Now, God's command to Noah was to replenish the earth, which meant to scatter abroad and to move out towards all the face of the whole world. But here we see that the people wanted to stay in one place because life was comfortable there. I mean, here they got the Tigris and the Euphrates River. They got abundant food because food grows greatly with water and topsoil. They had a good life, they thought, and they began, after the years passed, they began to think they were responsible for that good life that they were having. They had grown very comfortable, and they began to think, why should we leave? Why should we go anyplace else? In verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built. And so one of the goals of the builders was to build a tower to reach where God was. But this verse lets us know that they didn't reach that goal because God comes down to them. It says the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. And what it is their goal was to build and to create a utopian society, a perfect society without God. Sounds a lot like Scientology today. The movie stars out there have a false religion they call Scientology, which is everything is based on the inside. What can we do? We're going to do this and we're going to do that, but they're leaving God out. And here the same situation. They wanted to build a society without God, and it's going to fall short. Of course, it was the first attempt to build a tower to God. This set a precedent. And later in history, there were many towers that have been built to false gods, and they're called not cigarettes, but they're called Z-I-G, ziggurats. These towers, these false towers to worship false gods were called ziggurats. Many of these towers have been excavated in the Babylonian area today, and this is where that first tower was built. But chapter 2 tells us that they were in the land of Shinar. And Genesis 10:10 lists as 4 cities that were in the land of Shinar: Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. And later on in Shinar, we're told Babylon and Shinar were used to describe the same nation in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And later in Genesis chapter 14, Abraham helped defeat the king of Shinar to rescue his nephew Lot. That happened in chapter 14. But here many towers were later built to worship false gods in the land of Shinar. And one such tower was called Itiminaki. And it's still around. And it was a tower to worship the false god Marduk. And Marduk was the storm god and the fertility god. And the tower was 297 feet tall and still around. And but also later in history, when we read the Bible, we realize that these high places were usually used and associated with the worship of false gods. And we can see that in 2 Kings chapter 12, and we can also see that in Jeremiah chapter 48. And then in verse 6, and the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. And so, as we said earlier, God had been down this road before. That, he had already destroyed the world because of sin and because of disobedience and because people just wouldn't listen to his word. They just wouldn't listen to him. And, of course, God wanted the people to scatter and to repopulate the whole world. Instead, the people were gathered in one place. They still had one language. And God knew that the people would continue in this same direction, and that direction was east, as we've already said, and east is moving away from God. And he knew that they were going to go down and keep going in the same sinful direction from him, and so God was going to intervene. God was going to intervene to get the people back into the will of God. And, it's kind of like in today's society. When you're frying something in the pan, there's the old saying, it keeps getting hotter and hotter, and eventually the frog just doesn't jump out of the pan because it's the same way in the United States today. Things in the 30s, people were moral. You had a lot of morality on TV, and you had those kind of teachings. But as we move forward now, almost 100 years later to 2026, we've just progressively got just a little worse and a little worse and a little worse and a little worse to now where people are doing the things that they did in Noah's day, every imagination of their heart. There's just been anything you can dream up is legal now. Language has got terrible. Kids saying vulgar stuff. And the thing about it is they don't even think it's wrong. They don't even blink an eye when they say it. But the same thing here is happening. And God had been down this road before. And in verse 7, God said, let us go down, and that us refers to God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Ghost. This is the Trinity. And God's had a plan. God always has a plan. And he was going to confound their language that they could not understand one another. And this would put some confusion between them, and this would put some distance between them. And in verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. And so Genesis 1:28 and 9:1 tells us that God intended for people to replenish the earth and to scatter. And the people of the Tower of Babel, they were determined to do the other thing. They were determined to do otherwise. Therefore, God put his plan into action, and the people lost their ability to communicate with one another. And so this confused them, and so they began to leave. They began to quit building the city. And so their pride and arrogance had led to judgment. And that's what usually happens in the Bible, that pride and arrogance leads to judgment. It happened when the Israelites were exiled by the Babylonians in 612 and also 586 BC. The people began to think that they were responsible for, they were taking advantage of the poor. They had forgot about God. And when that happens, you know, God's judgment comes. And James 4:6 tells us, but he giveth more grace, wherefore he saith, God resisted the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. And so we find here that God rewards the humble. And in verse 9, therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. And so Babel is a Hebrew term that meaning confusion. But we even have that saying today when you're talking with somebody and you might say, well, you're just babbling on. And that's what that is. It's just confusion. But the Tower of Babel is a lesson that tells us that submission of God's plan brings blessings, but rebellion brings God's displeasure, resulting in suffering, and also can result in judgment. And today's cities and nations cannot defy the will of God and survive. If people omit God, and then society then is going to suffer for it. There's no other way to put it. That you cannot, sin brings on suffering. There's just no other way. And God can forgive the sin, but the consequences of the sin continue to roll on. It's like the ripple of the water. God can forgive sin, but the consequences of that sin keeps on going. But later in history, we find that the Babylonians, of course, they scattered the Jewish people because they exiled the Jewish people. And those 10 tribes, you see television commercials today of Jewish people suffering in Russia, asking for food and those kind of things. Those are the 10 lost tribes of Israel that God scattered upon the face of the earth. And they're in all different nations now. And it's a sad situation, but there's always judgment in disobedience, and sin causes suffering. But Luke 8:14 tells us that everyone that exalts himself shall be abased, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. And so God always has a problem with the arrogance of mankind, people who begin to think they're self-sufficient and they don't need God. And the people of Israel, as I've said, were exiled for feeling self-sufficient. And they became known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And God, by his grace, has been very good to the United States. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. Our country was founded by God, but the United States now is beginning to think they're responsible for the greatness. But God deserves the glory, and he deserves the credit for all that he's done. Jesus said, I am the vine, ye are the branches. Without me you will wither and die. And that is a true statement. When we begin to think that we are the ones responsible for our success, and we are the ones responsible for the United States' success, that's when you get in trouble. Because without God, we will wither and die. And that's what happened here in today's lesson. People begin to wither and die.